In the HTML web page, we have what is called the normal flow. By normal flow, we mean the normal way the browser renders the elements onto the page. The browser reads the code from left to right, and it displays the code from top to bottom. So the first code that it reads will be at the top of the page. Everything else will be stacked underneath it. This is called the normal flow of the document. In web page layout, we typically will change that normal flow. We can change it using the float property, flexbox, grid, and positioning. Here we see an example of the normal flow. On the left, you see the HTML elements and the order in which they are written in the HTML document is the order in which they are displayed onto the web page. Again, that can be altered using CSS. In CSS, we have what is called the box model, and that refers to, again, how these elements are rendered. In HTML, every element generates a rectangular box, so we can refer to that as the element box. The element box contains the content inside that box. That content is surrounded by padding inside that box. The edge of the content, or the edge of the box, is the border. The distance between these elements is called the margin. We use these properties for styling in page layout. So here we see a typical example of the box model. Here we have the box, which is indicated with our black border. Inside the box, we have the content area indicated in white. Between the content and the edge, we have the padding indicated in gold, and we can set around that box margins. In the HTML document, we have several types of box elements. The most common box element type is a block element. You may hear this referred to as a block box or a block level element. A block element generates a new line before and after the box. This new line is technically a margin. These boxes will stack on top of each other vertically. They are 100% width by default, although we can set a width. Most of your HTML elements are block elements. Your paragraphs, your sections, your new HTML5 elements, your divs, your headings, your lists. So here we see how these block elements not only stack on top of each other, but generate this new line margin before and after each one. We also have what are called inline elements. They may be referred to as inline box or inline level elements. These elements do not generate a new line or margin before and after the box. Therefore, you cannot set a top or bottom margin on these elements. However, you can set a left or right margin. These boxes or elements display horizontally. They go with the flow of the content. They are as wide as the content. You cannot set a width on an inline element, except for the image element. Bold, EM, span are inline elements. The image is an inline element. Your form elements are inline elements. We also have, thanks to CSS, what is called an inline block element. In order for an element to be considered an inline block element, it needs to be set with the CSS display property. They are not inherently inline block. Elements are inherently block or inline. However, an inline block element will act like a block element internally, but displays like an inline element externally. Therefore, they will display horizontally. They will all line up with the flow. The width will be as wide as the content in these elements. However, you can set a width. So we have the ability to use our block styling on these elements that look inline. A typical example as displayed here is with a navigation bar. Rather than floating the LIs to simply set the display property to inline block. However, as you can see, we can still set a width. We also have the containing block. Every element is laid out with respect to its containing block. Therefore, the layout of the block element that we are styling is dependent on the containing block. The containing block is essentially the parent. Every element has a parent. So these elements have inherent display properties, but we can alter them using the CSS display property. We can set an element to be a block element, an inline block element, and we can also set the display to none. By setting the display to none, we actually take that element out of the flow. It is no longer there. I would like to point out that the display property is also used in our flexbox and grid layouts, plus to display table elements and the list item element. In CSS, we have this concept of inheritance. Children inherit from parents. These box model properties are not inherited by default. So margin, padding, and border are not inherited by default. As you see here, the EM is a child of section, and it is not inheriting the styles being applied to the section element. However, those box properties can be inherited by using the value of inherit. This is a CSS value, which is a legal value of every CSS property. So if we want the child to inherit the value for a certain property, such as margin, we just use the inherit value. And therefore, whatever is set for the parent, it will automatically inherit it. When setting paddings and borders to an element that has a width, the padding and border by default are added to the width. So in this example, if we set a width of 200 and added 10 pixels of padding all around and a 2-pixel border all around, that will give us 10 pixels of padding on the right and left, 2 pixels of border on the right and left. That equals 22. The width is 200. Technically, the width is 222. And if you were floating these items, you might have to do some calculation based on the containing element in which those items exist. This can be very tedious to have to do. We have what is called the box sizing property. The box sizing property allows us to place values for padding and border along with the width so that the width retains its original value. So here we see the box sizing property being set to border box. The element will retain its specified width. So essentially, the padding and border are subtracted from it, so it maintains its width. However, the default, which is technically content box, allows the padding and border to be added to the width. You will see that most developers set out in their CSS document by applying the box sizing property set to border box to the asterisk selector so that they don't have to worry about calculations in their web page. There is also a concept of collapsing margins. When block elements are stacked on top of each other, if there are default margins set, or if there are values that we code in set, the browser doesn't necessarily add the bottom and the top of two adjacent block elements. What it will do, it will use the highest value. In CSS, you can have negative margins. What they will do is they will push the content up into the content on top of it. However, there is no such thing as a negative padding. The CSS box model is a very important part of page layout. Every element exists inside a rectangular box. Here on the left-hand side, I have a body section. I have a span element. I have 2 paragraphs, which you see following next. Underneath, I have 2 more spans and an unordered list. So the web page will execute in order in which the elements are listed. So we have what is called the normal flow, meaning the first elements under the body will be the first elements in the web page. Now that makes perfect sense. Should we use a technology such as Float or Flexbox, we can alter this normal flow. Our box model is based on 2 basic types of elements or containers or boxes: block elements and inline elements. A paragraph is an example of a block element. And the only way you can actually see where your boxes are is to use a background color or an outline or border to surround them so you can actually see where they are on the web page. Notice that the paragraph itself has a background color of yellow. That means that the paragraph is the width of 100% of the containing element. Every element is placed inside another element at some point. Ultimately, it might be just placed inside the body, as is the case with this paragraph. But every element will have a container element, which essentially is its parent. So by default, unless we specify a width, a block element will be 100% of the width of its containing element, which is also the parent. So width is a property of the box model. Block elements also have margins. Margin is the distance on the top, bottom, left, and right of that block. Block elements also have a property called padding. Padding is the inside roominess, and you can see there is not a lot of padding in this paragraph. An inline element is only as big as the content inside it, as you can see here with this span element. Notice that the background color and the text are essentially at the same width. You cannot set a width on an inline element. Inline elements do have margins and padding. Here we see 2 spans. Even though they are placed on top of each other, they render side by side because they are inline elements. So they have no width and they really have no right or left margins, other than 1 character of white space between them, which is similar to plain text. They do have padding, but there is very little padding inside these elements. If I were to set some padding for my paragraph and span, now you can see that they are roomier. So this is padding. Padding is the inside spaciousness inside that element. So in the box model, we have the element, we have the content, we have the inside of the element, which is which contains padding, and the outside of the element, which is the margin. If I wanted to adjust that margin, I can. Now we see the distance between the elements. So margin is the top, bottom, left, and right distance around an element. Padding is the inside distance between the actual content and the edge of the container. Around every edge of the container, we can place a border or an outline. Let's take a look at an unordered list that I have. Notice I have an outline of blue around the UL and an outline of red around the 3 LIs. They are all block elements. They all extend 100% the width of the web page because they are inside the body as the containing element. We have another type of box which is called an inline block box. So if I were to set the display property to inline block for my LI elements, notice that they would be placed side by side. Notice that they now are only as wide as the content because they have retained that characteristic of being inline. However, I can set a width to them because they still retain block level properties, and therefore I can change the width. Now I have added a border and a width to my section element. Notice in my second section I have an ID. Now I am going to apply a style called box sizing to my second section. Notice that all of a sudden it is not as wide as the top. In the box model, the border and padding are automatically added to the width. By using the box sizing property and setting the value to border box, we can maintain the width at 300 pixels. The box sizing property is commonly used in the industry so that we don't have to make calculations all the time.